Good morning, my name is Robert de Bok, I work for Adfinis, and today I'd like to show you something new in Ansible 2.11.1 specifically. 2.11.1 just came out this week, last week or so, so it's really fresh. And a new feature in there is the argument specifications. So typically roles can take arguments, maybe an installation location or a version or a boolean where it says yes or no to do something. And until now there was no structured way to test the input of a role. You could assert a lot of things, but it's quite a lot of work to write down, plus a lot of steps, so very visible during the play. Now there's argument specifications, which you can drop in meta argument specs.yml, and which contain a description of what's possible in the role. So you can read through it all yourself. It's quite understandable. Plus there's a few examples in there, so you should be good to go. Few things that caught my attention. There is a default, so for an option in your role. You can set a default. But that's actually only used for documentation, so the defaults still come from defaults main.yml. So that has not changed. So make sure this is the same in your argument spec file as it is in your defaults main.yml. There's no construction in place to make sure that they're the same or so. This is just for documentation, so you should keep them in sync yourself. One other thing that caught my attention is that you cannot set limits. For example, here's a 1024, I'm not sure what this is, an integer, some kind of an integer. If that integer can range from 0 to 2000 or something, there's no way to test that. So maybe that's a future release. I think this is more to prepare the roles to be documented automatically. So let's have a look at a role where I implemented or partially implemented it. I'm not sure if it even works. We'll see it together. I've got Ansible 2.11.1, just installed it. Great. That's required, so otherwise it won't work. And in this role, I've got meta argument specs, an extra file, a new file basically. So besides that, in there's a main.yml, probably a few other files, but in this case we're going to have a look at the argument specifications. So actually, in order to fully understand it, we need to open up defaults main.yml as well. Let's first briefly have a look there, because you see here there's 3 variables, 1, 2 and 3. So those must be defined then in the defaults. And indeed there's a user and a wait for, yes or no, and the timeout. So actually perfect. This is a string, should be a string. This is a boolean and this is an integer. So that's quite nice to write down here. We've got a bootstrap user, it's a string, it is required. It's also set, so that's fine. And the default is root. Once again, this is just for the documentation. The actual value of the default comes from defaults main.yml. And a description. Same for the wait for host, that is a boolean, yes or no. The default is no, it is required, and there's a description to it. And the last one, the integer here, it's a number, and 3 is the default, and it has a description. So that's nice. I'm not 100% sure why the short description and this description are required, but we'll figure it out. So if I do now molecule test, don't destroy it. We should see, I'll move it up. We should see the testing of the arguments pass by. This role also has assertions in there. Oh, sorry. And I will remove them later. Once this is standard, once this is more available and typically available on any system, probably in a year or so, I'll remove all the assertions. So this used to be the way to test variables, but as you can see, it's quite a lot to describe. Plus you really see it pass by in the play, which is a bit silly. It's a lot of steps sometimes, so it clutters the output a bit. Let's test it. we ran into an issue, and likely that's because I just changed a few things. Let's have a look. So it's trying to validate. That works. So it found that argument specs.yml, and there's something wrong. Let's have a read. Internal required and defaults are mutually exclusive. Okay, didn't know that. So it's either required or the default is set. Let's modify that. That's here. So what's the best option then? There is a default is required. Then it's not required, it's already set. Perfect. Yeah, all three values are actually set, so they're not required anymore because they're set. Let's have a look again. Move it up. Perfect. You see here that the argument specification tests are run and they're passing, they're green. Validating arguments against spec main. So there can be multiple specifications in there. I'm not sure when that's required, but in my case this is pretty simple, so main is good enough. You apparently can have multiple argument specifications in a single file. Well, the rest it will test the role and it probably will finish, but I hope that explains a bit what these argument specifications are. I think it's a really good step forward. It does mean that for your roles you probably want to write these argument specifications, and if you write a new role you probably start quite early in the process of development specifying the arguments. That gives you a good way to understand what is the input for this role. And of course you're not going to get every parameter in there, but a lot will probably be clear before you even start writing the logic in tasks. Well, I think it's a really good step forward. It makes running roles much more systematical, and for a consumer of a role it's probably much easier to understand if they are using the role correctly. So hope that's helpful for you, and hope to see you next time.